what I would like to see, and I think what's really important, is that all these other countries get together to try and protect and create a system that actually works for us and doesn't leave us out in the cold.
Welcome to the Focus Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Jenny Gordon, one of Australia's leading economists and public policy thinkers. As we prepared for this episode, it became clear that the issues we wanted to explore, from Australia's economic future and productivity challenges to demographics, artificial intelligence, and the changing global economy, simply couldn't be done justice in a single episode. So we've decided to bring you this discussion in two parts. In part one, we'll examine the foundations of the contemporary global trading order, where we are today, the challenges ahead, and the assumptions that may no longer hold. Then in part two, we'll explore what Australia can do about it, the policy choices available to us, and whether we can afford the future we want to build. We'll even talk a little about the US economy. Jenny, welcome to the Focus Podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, John.
Jenny, Australians have become accustomed to a relatively stable and prosperous economic environment. But when we look around the world today, the wars, the supply chain disruptions, strategic competition, artificial intelligence, and demographic pressures, are the assumptions that underpin Australia's economic success changing?
Well, they're certainly being shaken up. The fundamentals are still there. So for Australia, our prosperity relies on being able to trade. And so we have things that the rest of the world wants. And, we really want to be able to continue to sell the things that they want in order that we can buy the things that we're not very good at producing. And we become very reliant on that. And a model of self-sufficiency would be a very poor standard of living indeed. I mean, we have enough food. We'd need to do something about liquid fuel to actually get it to the places it needs to be. But we still rely on all the tech, mostly comes from overseas, most of our medical tech, a lot of the pharmaceuticals. I mean, the things that actually really matter for how people live, we need to import. And it's not just importing the thing nowadays, it's actually importing the software updates that go with the thing. And so that connection, so it's not just about the physical trade, it's about the digital trade that matters as well. So we're sitting here having done extremely well out of the global trading system, and it's now under threat. But we've got a lot of other countries in the same basket as we are. And so what I would like to see, and I think what's really important, is that all these other countries get together to try and protect and create a system that actually works for us and doesn't leave us out in the cold.
You know, Jenny, having a look at the economic debates over the last few years, why do you think something like import substitution has become a dirty word when applied to a place like Australia? I mean, I understand what you say. We don't have much industry here. We got rid of a lot of it in the 60s and 70s. But if we wanted to kickstart the Australian economy, obviously we need to buy in industry and skills and all that kind of stuff. And yes, we may have to substitute some of the stuff that we buy from overseas for indigenous built. Why is that not a thing anymore?
Well, I'm old enough to remember the 70s, and
Me
and
too.
what was going on, right?
Yeah.
Um, So it was grim. And so what
Mm.
you had was protection had allowed domestic industry to continue to survive. We made white goods, we made Holden cars, we largely had this domestic industry. We still exported a lot of product and we still imported a lot of the inputs into those manufacturing industries. And a lot of them were foreign owned. But because of our scale, they were really inefficient compared to the global scale. And none of those foreign owners or Australian owners were willing to invest in the new technology that would have actually reduced our costs of production and produced a better product. So what we ended up with was old product, so clunker cars, old washing machines. So mind you, I tend to think sometimes those old washing machines are better than some of the new ones today, but that's a whole
Absolutely.
other area. Certainly fridges, things
Yeah.
like that. Um, and so we they were just running down the machinery and plant and equipment that they had because they didn't want to invest. And so things were just getting worse and worse and worse. And so we were sitting there and looking at that beginning of the 70s. And in 1964, um, the Lucky Country was written, and it sort of was already flagging where we were going and how far we were falling behind, and sort of making the point that it's all okay because we've got beautiful beaches and a nice lifestyle, so that's the trade-off, and we're happy with it. But you get to some point where people go overseas, people see what there is, and go, "Hang on a sec, why can't we have that here?" And so that was the problem. So we needed to do something, and unfortunately we're just too small to be competitive, and our labor is too expensive to be competitive on anything that's labor intensive. Um, Nowadays, if you imported a whole bunch of machinery, you'd be very capital intensive, wouldn't employ very many people. Yes, you could produce stuff in Australia, but you would have tiny production runs for just the domestic market compared to the size of the production runs that you get like in China or elsewhere. And one of the problems about protection is it just means the incumbents don't have to try very hard. And so productivity was really low because they didn't have to try hard. They had a captured market. Every time when things went wrong, they either asked for a tariff increase or for more handouts from the federal government or the state governments. And we still see some remnants of that today. Rather than update and make the investment, we're not competitive because we don't have the scale, which is just really, really tough. It's just a function of technology that makes a big difference. And then when you have to stick it on ships and send it a long way away, you've got a lot more transport costs associated with it. So there's only some things we can be highly competitive on, either because we're massively efficient at producing it, such as iron ore, um, or because it is really high value compared to volume. Um, so there's scope for us in digital technologies because, high value compared to volume. But medical technologies and some of the things that we've done really well on are actually because of that. We add so much value to the product that it's worth shipping it and providing the support for it because a lot of that software support is now done digitally as well. So you can support a product overseas because you've got those communication lines in place. So that's where we will excel, but it will be niche pockets here, there, and everywhere. And it won't necessarily be, we have to sell overseas to get the scale, because if you don't have the scale, the domestic market, your firm will go bust. You can't make the level of investment you need unless you've got a big market to sell it to.
Okay, I mean, that makes perfect sense, Jenny, and we will talk about AI a little bit later in more detail, but just for now, and just to continue on from what you said, I mean, I understand that we would have had a scale problem back in the 1970s. Our population base was smaller, our industrial sizes were obviously limited. We had the unions to contend with, so there were a lot of inefficiencies, and the tariff system itself was an inefficiency. It didn't help Australian manufacturers allow themselves to invest in the country, as you rightly pointed out. But we're living in an AI age where you can probably shed most of your human workforce. The robots aren't going to be unionized. You could literally flood any market that you paid attention to by just scaling up massively to dump product on a market that you want. So, in a capitalist environment, what prevents us from just buying the robots, scaling up, producing TVs, producing, I don't know, whatever the electronic good of the moment happens to be, iPhones, for instance, and just flooding the market with that stuff? What is the thing that prevents us from even thinking along those lines?
Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons why we're not doing that. One is we don't own the IP on a lot of it, so we didn't develop it.
Yes.
So,
Right.
you know, and
Steal it.
those companies are going to stick their production in places where you've still got a labor cost associated with it. The US firms went into China for two reasons. One was the low labor cost, but the other one was they wanted to access that Chinese market. Their 1.4 billion or whatever it is far more attractive than our, you know, 27 million type thing. So that's our problem. So you've got that basics. The other things, the things that we offer are, um, political stability, a skilled workforce, but there, even in the skilled workforce, we fall short because there's areas where we don't have the skills we need. And we also have a lot of the developed economy problems of it takes a long time to ramp up to do anything because local planning laws, all those sorts of things that just add costs to anybody who said, I have a brilliant idea. I think we can be highly competitive because I can do it all with robots. I need to import my robots, but I can do that because I know I'm going to have a market. But then where is my market and who else is competing for it? And so this is why we're quite good at some of those niche products that are new to market because we get in there and we're first movers. But because they're niche, they're not going to be replacing iron ore or anything like that, right? So
Yeah.
we've got to have more of them. And unfortunately, the Australian government has just declined the amount of money they've spent in basic R&D over the last several decades. So it's just fallen off a cliff. Um, and we've been relying on foreign students for universities to fund their research. And so we don't have that flow of the ideas. And in particular, it's actually the skills that go with it that really matter.
You're right. We do have a lot of good IP in Australia, but we're just not able to scale it up to in a way that will allow us to profit from it. You know, the only other thing that we can do is we can establish, a company, say, in the United States, or we can establish a company somewhere in Europe where the population and the industrial base is much larger. But that's like giving away the gold that Australia has, and we don't benefit as much from that as if we had our own IP being taken care of here, because that would actually give us our own sovereign capacities. We farm it out when we have to because there is that ceiling. How much of that is actually a product of the capitalism that we currently live under? Or how much of that is actually just the sheer limits of Australia? Because I mean, we can talk about the limits of Australia, but 27 odd, 28 million people, it's still reasonable. It still could look after itself, but how could it look after itself under the current economic climate or conditions?
Well, what we see is where technology is gone is the advantages in specialization, back to sort of Adam Smith and the pin factory. But we've got pin factory on steroids now. So
Yeah.
specialization in different components of doing things, the process of time on the other to get a product at the end. The value add is really high in the design. And if you can tie up your IP and don't have anybody steal it off you, right, that will
Mm,
erode the value of that IP. But that's the value is in that design part. And then you have
mm,
to manufacture all the various high-tech components of it. But
yeah.
then you get to the assembly, which is the lowest value add part. And then there's the packaging. And then you're up in the top end of the smile diagram, which is also high value, which was the sales and the after sales service of a product. And so where you make your most money is in the two ends of the smile. So at the
Mm,
beginning when you're doing the design and at the end when you're selling the product. So if we're selling the product to a domestic market, that's inherently not that bigger. If you're only focused on the domestic market, you're not getting that much. And then if you're doing the
mm,
design investment and only selling it to the domestic market, you're not getting that much either. And so what we've seen is specialization throughout that. Now, Australia is not terribly integrated into international supply chains partly because we're a long way away. So if we're doing the design bit of it, we tend to, you know, companies will go offshore to develop and be part of that rest of that chain. Right.
yeah.
So sometimes they still own it and they're, that chain happens and then they get a lot of that value add because it comes back to them. But domestically, there's only so much they can do. So, the value add bits are the bits that really matter. And so sending out and either establishing overseas or contracting out to other providers, those other bits that they're really good at doing. So they're really, you have packaging specialists. I mean, China has specialty firms in almost every bit of it, and they're innovative. So they will
Mm,
also work out how to drive down each bit of that packaging to being absolutely optimized and how to build a machine and factory that actually does that to minimize the cost of doing that packaging. So it's not like we thought of in the old sort of, British industrial empire where you dismantled plant and equipment to move it to India to produce cotton in India because the labor costs were lower and it was close to the supply of cotton. it's not like that anymore. It's there's constant this sort of innovation, and this has been the thing that's been driving productivity growth um, over time. So
Mm,
it's been a really important component, and that specialization has actually really mattered. So one of our problems is we want the widget at the end or the thing at the end, but we don't have all those elements on that supply chain along the way. So we're going to be really clunky and we're going to add a lot of costs every single time we do every one of those bits instead of relying on someone else. So what we've done is we've tended to do a lot of when we think about a supply chain, you start with your raw materials. We do a lot of that, right? And we send that off, and we're very, very good at doing that. And technology matters there. So Australia led the world in robotic mining because we wanted to get people out of the mines. For two reasons. One is you don't want your workers hurt, and industrial accidents are terrible things for the people involved. But the other reason is industrial accidents are really expensive because you close down the mine for weeks after industrial accident to try and work out what happened and to deal with the ramifications of it. Interruptions to production are incredibly expensive. And so we had this development of technology to deal with those particular problems. So a lot of our R&D has actually been in mining and in agriculture. We're kind of like agricultural R&D. And this is all, for all these industries say we've done it all ourselves, public money has been a big part of that R&D in both mining and in agriculture. And so
mm,
we've been pushing up and managing how do you increase Australian soils, unfortunately, are pretty crap. Um,
mm,
so, so how well agriculture has done has been very much about plant breeding. It's about being optimizing. Australia led the way in some of the precision agriculture technologies where, now machines spray and put down fertilizer to the square meter so that you don't put seed and fertilizer down on bits of land that aren't productive, and you put that down on the bits that you get high yields from. And the payoff, they'll do that calculation of payoff. I mean, this is the level of technology involved in agriculture now. And so even agriculture, which we think of as very Australian, is dependent on fertilizer imports. Now we can do
yeah,
something about that. And we have actually set up a new fertilizer plant up in Gladstone. But again, we're more expensive than importing it at the moment. But that's one area where self-sufficiency, or at least greater self-sufficiency, is possible and also probable that we'll move in that direction. But you actually have all the machinery. Most of that is now imported. We
mm,
make very little of this high-tech machinery anymore. And so if we want to continue to get the yields we're getting, we need to be able to bring in that high-tech machinery. And again, we might be successful in some areas to developing some things that we can ship, but we're small market, and so we need to, we'll be bringing back some of it. Um, so these are the problems, right? We're very integrated into the global economy in so many ways. There's almost nothing we use or consume that is simply, grown without any foreign tech or inputs from the point at which, even in the seeds in your garden might well have a plant variety owned by overseas or something, right? And
yeah, yeah.
so this is one of our problems. So this sort of simple idea of self-sufficiency sounds wonderful, but it's really, really hard to achieve.
Is that because we plan to support a global trade flow rather than work at more regional and decentralized nodes? I mean, how much of this is a matter of organizational issues? Like if we plan to support international trade under free trade agreements, I mean, you need to scale up for supporting that. But if you were to break the system down into much smaller units or subunits, if you will, you could do a lot more locally because you're supporting a smaller economic unit.
That's a really so there's a lot of really interesting questions about regionalism, right? So what you're doing is when you go regional, you're saying as long as the people in my region and their productive capabilities and the size of their market and their tastes and preferences as such, then I can optimize by working with them within that
Mm.
region. But the problem
Yeah.
is for some of them, their opportunities will be also, the more they branch out, the more you've got the option to sell to a bigger market, the option to choose technologies from a bigger market, to access investment from a bigger market. All of those things raise your choice and hence your options. And they also improve competition. So if we end up, specializing and being within just a smaller region, then we're just as reliant on the people and the players in that region. And so the economic coercion power that they will have is similar. And so you think, for example, if you tried to get efficient scale on something in Australia, right? So you
Mm.
have one producer of it to get maximum scale. They don't face any competition,
Yeah.
right? So they can charge what they like. So you might have got rid of concerns about coercion from China, but you've just created concerns about coercion from your local monopoly. Or if you have a smaller
Yeah.
region, you've just replaced your so the broader diversity you can engage with, the more options you have. And so if you think about when China put the sanctions on Australian barley and beef, timber, lobsters, wine,
Wine.
coal.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Um, so when they did that, we turned to the rest of the world. So we were able to negotiate agreements to put our barley into other markets. And the Chinese had to buy barley from somewhere. So they had to buy it from the markets that, Australian products. So we had things got moved around. So if everybody's optimized, this is costly. It costs
Mm.
everybody a little bit more. But because barley is reasonably similar commodity, now experts in barley will tell me that there's different types of barley and barley ain't just barley. And, our barley was the best for Chinese beer, so they really suffered because they couldn't get our great barley. But
Yeah.
barley at least is a commodity, right? Roughly.
Yeah.
Um, but you really see this how that helped us. The only one we couldn't do is wine, right?
Mm.
Red wine was a really hard one because it's in bottle and it takes a long time to develop a market. And Australia had worked very hard to develop the red wine market in particular into China. You
Yeah.
had bottles were already labeled, right? So you had taste preferences. Wine is actually a highly tailored product to a particular market.
Mm.
So that was harder. And then none of the other suppliers of red wine stood back and said, we don't like the fact that China is pummeling you, Australia. We're not going to sell them our red wine. The Californian producers, you the South
Mm.
Africans, the Chileans, the Argentinians all went wacko. We'll sell China all the wine it wants. And thank God, Australia's created this big wine drinking nation and we'll sell
Mm.
to it now that, they've decided to block Australia out of it. And so
Yeah.
Australian wine industry is still suffering from that because we had created that market, tailored our production towards that market, or large chunks of it had. And so we're seeing now concerns about overproduction. There's some wine producers that have massive storage tanks full of red wine that they're not sure what to do with. There's only so much you can sell on the domestic market. Um, and so those are some, so that industry is still facing the ramifications of that. And what we'll probably see is a government structural adjustment package to assist the industry to adjust to what had been really something that they'd geared up for. But tastes are also changing. So the Chinese are actually drinking less wine, as are most young people in Australia nowadays.
But the Chinese have their own wine industry as well, which would also be competing with
Yes.
the imports coming in. I can't recall. I can't recall the region that's focusing specifically on wine production, but apparently they've got some very good varietals, and the product is great, and it's tailor made for local flavors and taste profiles, and so on and
Yep.
so forth.
Yep.
So again, now that China is starting to develop its own domestic capacities in that area, that's going to be hurting the importers, Australia, Chile, South Africa, France, all of those who thought that, oh, well, Australia's now fallen over, we'll just go inside there and dominate the marketplace. Well, you can't really dominate the marketplace when the local Chinese are developing their own market to displace the foreign product.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's
And we do that in
kind of
some
crazy.
areas too, So we'll
Yeah,
develop a
yeah.
domestic market and try and displace foreign product coming in when
Mm,
some producer here can get sufficient technological advantage, which is the thing that really
yeah,
matters for us,
yeah.
something that makes our product more appealing to access that external market. So that's what
Capitalism
we have to do.
is very complex when you look at it from this perspective, but I need to rope you back to geopolitics because that's my bailiwick, and I'm not an economist. You are, so maybe you can shed some economic light on good old Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's comments at this year's Davos summit, where, I raised the issue earlier with regard to regionalism. Mark Carney came forward and made some very bold pronouncements saying that the age of globalized American led hegemony is over. We're all going to have to get used to friendshoring. We're all going to have to get used to regional building. Now, from what you've just said to me, there are limits upon which we can do that economically. There are also limits to how we go about this geopolitically, because the same thing applies. You may be able to get rid of the Americans out of a particular area, but then you're subject to the whims of the larger, more powerful state that you're hooking up with, even within the region. So there is going to be competition. There's going to be countries trying to have one over other countries within a regional context, just as it is in an international context. So, what did you think of Mark Carney's performance in Davos? And does it actually mean we're going down this route? Or do you see the current globalized structure going through a couple of ructions, but it's really going to come back with a vengeance once things start settling down?
Well, I don't think it's going to come back with a vengeance unless there's a whole bunch of work to bring it back. Um,
Right. Where's it
so,
gone? Where's it gone?
well, so the WTO is a really interesting story, right? So it started off with the GATT, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, and that
Yeah,
took years to negotiate. So, um, it was I think it was the Uruguay round that Australia was actually very, very involved in. And we
that's
were
right. Yeah.
very instrumental in bringing down tariffs on agricultural products in particular, because it really benefited us to be able to sell into the global market because we're
Yeah.
highly efficient, the scale really mattered, and so that's one of the things that Australia was very, very effective on doing. So we were really active participant in that whole development. The WTO then was established, and the Doha round, which was the next round of sort of major agreements, never actually concluded. Um, so the thing about the WTO and GATT before it is it had a couple of principles that are really important. So
Mm.
the first one is called national treatment, which is really non-discriminatory, which is I'm going to treat a foreign firm like I treat my domestic firms. And so
Right.
that's kind of the national treatment. And then the other part is most favored nation. And so that says if I give you a concession, you're going to give me, so I'm going to give that concession to everybody else, right? And so under the WTO rules, it basically stopped a lot of trade coercion, which is
Mhm.
why, of course, the Trump administration is trying to take away those principles out of the WTO rules, right? So they did
Yeah.
actually they finally paid their dues to the WTO and then came in with a proposal to undermine exactly that, to say, well, we're the US, we should be able to do whatever we want. And the thing that Carney was saying is that the US has always cheated, if you like. They've always excluded themselves from various things, is a better way of
Yeah.
putting it, right? Because they're
Yeah.
big. Just the same way they haven't actually signed on to the International Criminal Court. There are
Mhm.
things where the US says, we're big, we're important, we're powerful, we don't have to comply.
Mhm.
But by and large, we'll support the rules because we think the system is worth supporting. And what we've seen over the last decade, and it really started under the Obama administration, and it's coming out of this sense that they've seen a hollowing out of their manufacturing. loss of jobs that have been highly regionally concentrated. So you have place-based disadvantage that has exacerbated. The gains to trade for the US have been enormous because, particularly its intellectual property, it gets paid for. Look at Australia's trade agreement, intellectual property, and our payment to the US for intellectual property for almost forever is baked in. Um, so they've done extremely well, but they haven't shared the gains. And the losses have been really regionally concentrated. And so the US's inability to have had structural adjustment packages for those regions or to have worked out how to have place-based solutions, to have a reasonable welfare system that actually looked after people, those are the US failures, but they've said that's not, it's, we didn't fail, it's all China's fault. And it's much easier politically to say it's all China's fault, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
so you've got the US has slowly over time become less and less, um, you know, more and more concerned about how do we stop trade with China. And you can understand it when you've been the leading global power for another country to come along and say, we'd like a bit of the action. And in particular, where China wants the actions is they want more influence over standards and the things that will advantage their firms to do well. Now, how did they get there? Well, they got there through massive amounts of state subsidies
Mm,
for those firms, but a hugely competitive internal market um, where they really honed, like the internal competition was savage. So the
mm,
products that came out of it were globally competitive, right? Something that Australia could never do because our domestic market's way too small. So if we start subsidizing producers here, they'll go, that's my gravy train, I'll stick with it, thank you very much. And we know they're being very good at doing that. China has a
yeah.
different system. And so the stuff that comes out of it has been incredibly competitive. And that's the problem is that, you know, you can say that they deliberately set out to undermine and erode business opportunities and make America vulnerable to that, to them controlling things. I maybe so in critical minerals, but for the rest of it, it's probably just that's how they saw about developing and they saw technology as a way of doing it. They massively invested in science and engineering. They're graduates, it just even they are now well above the US in the papers, academic papers written in engineering and some of those science areas because they've
Mm,
invested so heavily in that. Um, so, how deliberate it all was, but that's where they've got that critical mineral control. And it's partly because, we export lithium to them, and
mm,
they process it there. Because we don't want to process it here because we don't want, our environmental standards are higher. It's energy and power, and water intensive. It's polluting. We don't. So they have done that in places because part of, again, the system could run roughshod over the preferences of the local people. Um, so you've got this very, this US that really doesn't quite know what to do. And so Biden's reaction, well, that's the Obama's reaction to it was to start saying going to have a pivot to the
mm,
Indo-Pacific, rebuild our trade ties there because they kind of let them that hadn't worried too much about them. Trump comes in and Trump won. He refuses to appoint appellate judges to the WTO body because they feel like it's being captured on the trade disputes because they're not getting the answers that they want. So they were moving towards a more protectionist stance. Countries were taking them to the WTO over that and saying, so particularly the steel and aluminium tariffs in Trump one. And so that led them to say, well, we'll take our bat and ball and go home, or at least we
mm,
won't let you play the game, right?
mm,
And so what
mm,
happened was a bunch of other countries, and this is Carney's thing in operation, set up the multi-party agreement within the WTO to act like an appellant body and resolve these things. And so that's where we took our disputes against China to. And so we had a mechanism, even though it was slow, we had a mechanism that said, China, if you want to impose these punitive tariffs on Australia on the basis of, you know, they had claimed anti-dumping, they had claimed phytosanitary violations. Those were probably the really big ones. Um, then you've got to prove your case. And, you know, we said we're going to the WTO. And what happened was these things were resolved, right? So the
Mm.
Chinese, we put in our case, they put in their case, and then they went, Uncle, we'll get rid of this. We've made our point,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So yes, they flex their muscles. And they've done it on rare earths and magnets and things a few times. So you've got that, that's effective. That's what Carney was talking about, really. So he was saying the US is no longer really supporting the rules of the game. In fact, he's actively undermining the rules of the game. And Trump, too, has just gone on that with the trade agreements and Liberation Day tariffs. And
Yeah.
they've got a new name for these agreements. I wrote it down because I could never remember it. Agreements on reciprocal trade, ART. But in these agreements, there's all sorts of there's what we call poison pill clauses in some of them that says
Mm.
if you do anything we don't like with another country, we're going to pull this agreement and whack massive tariffs on you again. And the country signed up to this because they had no choice, right? So this is what Carney was saying. The US is no longer supporting that rules-based system. Countries can come together within that WTO system and actually support the rules. And what we need is those countries, this is this middle power thing, to come together
Mm.
to actually not just do it on, the appellant body, an alternative to the appellant body to maintain those rules, but say, we want these rules, which is about, you know, really national treatment, most favored nation,
Mm.
reciprocity, and non-discrimination. That's what the WTO is really about. Go back to those core principles and say, we're going to keep doing that and we're going to cooperate to do that. And when we form agreements, we will have agreements that work together. So the CTP, that one,
I
CPTPP,
can't do
that one.
that. So good
Yeah,
on you, Jenny, for
yeah.
saying it.
Which the UK has just recently joined. So
Okay.
it's
Yeah, yeah.
now
The
13 countries, I think.
CPTPPUK.
Yeah, that one. Right.
Yeah,
Since
right.
it's partnership in the Pacific,
Yeah. Yeah,
the
yeah.
UK says by extension, I'm happy. But he's got a set of quite comprehensive rules. And
Mm.
so those rules bind the members to trade and invest and behave according to those rules. And so people have sort of forgotten about the institutional architecture and how important it actually is to make global trade work, but even
Mm.
domestic production to work. We've got contracts get honoured. There's a mechanism that you can contest if contracts are not honoured. Labour law is about a whole bunch of contracts between your workers and your labour.
Yeah.
And there's this institutional architecture that sits under the market economy and sits under and makes capitalism work, right? And so
Mm.
what we're saying is that we need attention to that institutional architecture. And what we did was we sort of, and I'm an economist and I went to Harvard, so it's not quite as bad as the Chicago guys who said, get government out of everything. We don't need anything of this. The market will solve it all, right? So
Right.
yeah, we called ourselves the saltwater economists versus the freshwater economists up on the Great Lake. So institutions matter, and so the markets work because the institutions underpinning them are reliable. You know what they're going to be, so you've got predictability, so you can invest with certainty, you can trade with certainty. There's rules around the fact that you will actually get paid. There's rules around how you behave. So what Carney is really saying is in a world where the US no longer cares about the rules, and China actually still at least has rhetoric about caring about the rules because they're highly interdependent, right? Their economy falls over if countries close their markets to China,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, China is much more dependent. Like the US, trade has never been an enormous share of the US GDP, right? So Whereas China, trade is an enormous share, or a very, very important share, even though it's an enormous domestic market. Um, so and their imbalance is a massive problem, and something needs to happen about that. But in the absence of China expanding domestic demand, which what it really needs to do, reducing its subsidies to its domestic producers and expanding its domestic demand. In the
Mhm.
absence of them doing that, we need everybody else because countries are going to be threatened by that dumping by China. Right. And at the moment, they're in the WTO. So that dumping has mechanisms where we can take them and counter that. And the thing is that when you bring in a anti-dumping case, you can whack high tariffs on legally under the WTO. So
Mhm.
you can put tariffs on if, say, China said to Europe, well, we're going to just dump a whole bunch of vehicles in Europe. Europe would be entitled to put high tariffs on China for that. And so that would be legal under the WTO. China would appeal it under the WTO, and you'd have a mechanism to doing something about it.
Jenny, it seems to me from what you've just said that the market isn't quite as free as many people have claimed, or at least it may have been freer, but now it's not going to be as free. You've got on the one side the United States, which is marching to its own beat, using its political prerogative as being the number one economy in the world to do whatever it likes under Trump. You've got the Chinese on the other side, which can't do what the Americans do, but is enmeshing itself in Carney's middle power collective, where they can negotiate frameworks among themselves for the betterment of free trade among themselves, excluding the United States, but still having the elephant of China in the room, which they have to deal with. And I think over time, China will find a way in which it could use its muscle to dominate the smaller countries, the other markets that it needs to access. Because obviously, we've all bought into the China dream, right? So China makes a cheap product that we all want. So it's going to be harder and harder for us to pull those two things aside, and it'll be far easier over time for China to influence that grouping of countries like Canada, Australia, perhaps, and all the other countries who want to have free trade, but know that the United States is not going to be reliable as a partner in free trade moving forward. That's a geopolitical nightmare just there. Can you give us some good news? I mean, what is the good news story from all of this? Because at the moment it sounds like a bloody nightmare moving forward, right? And complex. Don't forget the complex. There's the legal aspect to all these agreements. There are all the other things about America pulling itself out. Then there are we haven't even talked about American monopolies and what they're tending to do because, of course, they've grown to such a point. Elon Musk now being the first trillionaire, he himself, as a sovereign entity in the United States, will have an effect on global trade in areas where his companies dominate. So it ain't going to be easy, however you sell it, right?
No, it's not easy. And
Mm.
so your sort of argument around that China isn't actually, I mean, it's in the WTO. And the US
Yeah,
has not left the WTO yet. It's actually still a member of the WTO. It's trying
well,
to
that's a
change the
surprise.
rules, right?
Yeah, okay.
And China has for some years worked hard to try and put Chinese people into senior positions within the UN system.
Yep.
And so, which has been dominated by Europeans and Americans for, since inception. Right. So,
Mm-hmm.
and so the Chinese have worked very hard to do that. They have certainly managed to put quite a lot of people into more senior positions, but there's a question of the level of influence they've had because, again, you actually have quite a lot of rules around, you have to take most of the members with you if you want to change anything. And so if people are concerned about China's behavior, so there's pushback on China too. So it's not as
Mm.
though China can waltz in and say, we'll come in and we'll be the friend and we'll slowly make sure we control everything and then you're under our thumb. We've actually got a lot of countries who are fully cognizantly aware of the risks of domination by China. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Australia has limited a lot of the foreign investment by China because we're concerned about security concerns. Now, whether that's been the right thing to do or not, I don't know. Japan has done likewise. We've actually limited research collaborations as well, on the basis of these security issues. Some of that is because the US has said, well, if you want to be in with us, you can't be within with them, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right?
Yep.
Now, we
Yep.
don't want that. So what we don't
Mm,
want is that kind of, we don't want the US saying to us, yeah, with us, and you do whatever we want, and put up with it, um, or you're against us, and we're going to try and take you down and put massive tariffs on whatever and like. And
mm.
China kind of would like to do the same, but it doesn't quite. It's a bit more still reliant, so it can't quite play the same game, except it's got rare earths. So as Iran has discovered with the Straits of Hormuz, if you've got one
Mm.
essential thing, you got a lot of power. You don't
Yep.
necessarily need to develop the other ones. If you've got that trigger, if people behave that badly, you can say, I'm pulling my trigger. Um,
Mm, mm,
and the US for a long time has had control of the global financial system and has pulled that trigger regularly and punished firms that have traded with Iraq and Iran and various Afghanistan over the years previously. So, you know, you've got to, what we got to do is get the middle guys to keep both of them in their place and say, this is what we've got to work towards. And we've just got to keep repeating it. We've just got to keep saying, you know, don't make an agreement with China or with the US that excludes other countries.
Yeah,
Don't think,
but national Jenny, sorry to interrupt, but you know, national interests, being as they are, will naturally prevent middle power countries that hold on to their sovereign interests as hard as they possibly can from making these sort of arrangements where, in the short term at least, they profit from a closer alignment with China on the one side or the United States on the other. So, what I'm trying to determine here is how coherent could a Carney style structure possibly be when you've got two giants? You've got the Chinese on the one side doing their own thing, the Americans on the other side doing their own thing, and both of them being so goddamn powerful that really the folk in the middle, they're going to align one way or the other because, of course, they're not going to do the complex thing. They're not going to create a third way. I mean, I hate using that because it's tainted by Tony Blair, but there's no third way here, right? There's great power politics and great power economics. And the center of gravity, the center of gravity belong to both, really, don't they?
well,
It,
unfortunately, if we don't push back, right? If we don't try, then we're doomed. So we may as well try, okay?
But it would take a
And
lot of discipline. It would take, honestly, when you think of the number of countries and the diverse interests at stake within that middle group, within the non-China, non-American group, you know, everyone has to march to one beat among themselves to try to fend off the two largest guys in the room.
not necessarily, because your best way to defend off is to have partnerships,
Mm,
right? So your
mm,
best, because every, no country is self-sufficient, right? You look at Japan, right? You
yep.
know, they produce 38% of their food and 12% of their energy. They
Mm,
need to import that stuff. They're
yep.
not independent, right? They could potentially cut China and the US off, and as long as everybody else was willing to trade with them, they'd be fine. Okay, so
Okay.
this is
Okay.
I mean, I'm not saying life would be great. There'd be a whole bunch of technology issues and other stuff going on, right? But that's the point, is that even though US is big and China is big, um, as long as it stays in the economic realm and doesn't move into the kinetic national security sort of or cyber attack type realm, which is
Mm,
warfare, right? As long as we
yeah.
stay outside, all bets are off once we move to kinetic. And is that the way we want the global economy to adjust, as to have World War III? I don't think that's a really good idea. So
Mm,
the point is that the cooperation is the thing that is going to help these countries survive. Our best bet is cooperation. So it's interesting. Singapore and New Zealand have just signed an agreement. on trade in essential supplies, right? So they've agreed
Right.
that they would continue to trade and make sure that New Zealand supplied the food and things to Singapore that needs, and Singapore would supply them with technology and things that they need. This is the
Mm.
stuff that's going on. So quite a lot of it is bilateral, like that one. But a lot of these bilateral agreements aren't mutually exclusive. They're not saying, and now Singapore and New Zealand won't trade with anybody else. That'd be nuts, right?
Mm,
But
mm,
they're
mm,
saying
mm,
this is actually a pattern. This is something that others can join. And so this is the way that middle powers will do it. And then they're saying, we've got a WTO framework. We can work together within it. We've got a bunch of UN bodies of standards. We can work within those. And so we've got a framework and a structure there that we can
mm.
say to both China and the US, we're going to cooperate. If you want to join us, terrific. So it's non-exclusionary, right? It's not saying,
Yeah.
no, 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 you've got to stay over there. Our problem is the US is saying you can't do anything with China. And that's what those poison pill agreements, these clauses are. Um,
Mm.
and China is saying we'd like to continue to do what we've been doing for ages, and you've got to buy our stuff and don't tell us that we're subsidizing it too much. And I mean, in many ways, if if China was a democracy, at some point you'd be going, hang on a second, I'm a Chinese person, I'm paying my taxes. Why are those taxes going to subsidize stuff going to people in the rest of the world? And I'd be pretty pissed off about it. It's not a democracy, but they have their own internal problems. They need
Yeah.
growth because if they don't have growth, they have provinces and regions that are pretty unhappy. And so growth is the only thing that they're able to buy people off with.
But
So that's a
growth is the
different issue.
problem. Growth is the problem, though, right? I mean, we're looking at a world which has taken on the freshwater economists, as you so politely call them, the Chicago School economists, led by the likes of Milton Friedman and his thinking about the economy. And, you're looking at a system where, okay, this is the way things are, but the economic model doesn't seem to be holding tight, and it's having domestic political ramifications as well. Arguably, it's caused a disconnect between our political and corporate leadership with the local communities that they come from, namely the people. So there is a sort of gap that has emerged, and it's a gap that will continue to solidify and probably extend outwards. But there's also something else, and that is growth isn't happening when we're looking at massive demographic shifts. And I'm not talking that countries are getting bigger, they're getting smaller. And the smaller countries are, the smaller your economy becomes over time. The smaller your industrial bases are, the more limited the products that you can deliver to market because there's just not enough people to, you know, keep the growth levels going as we did in the 1990s. So if you actually work all this out, Jenny, again, it's a sort of like, I mean, I don't know, I'm not an economist, but from a geopolitical perspective, it just looks like a bloody mess because, okay, so if the neoliberal economic models that we've predicated much of the global economy on aren't working well politically, domestically, and will have repercussions moving forward, do you see that there might be a different form of economics that will take over as a consequence of that? I mean, can you say something about modern monetary theory and, universal basic income, for instance? Because I hear that that's been around the traps for quite some time, but no one's really rolled this out. I mean, it's still something people like to tinker with, talk about, debate over, but in the end, it's still the Gordon Gekko greed is good mentality that dominates the corporate sector all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism and markets are the best way to allocate. So markets are the best way to allocate resources.
Hmm.
Because if you don't have markets allocate resources, I mean, even China uses markets to allocate resources, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
if you don't, you have somebody dictating that allocation of resources. And that's always going to go very, very wrong. So even with better, like the whole sort of cybernetics thing now that,
Yeah.
um, you know, Sterling Beer was on about, you could have factories reallocating production and being driven by workers and those kinds of things that
Mm-hmm.
we've got the data now to have those flows. The answer is no, it's still doesn't work that well compared to letting the market do it and using prices as a signal to reallocate resources. The problem has always been that we haven't, the problem has been that unfortunately markets also, and the rules are established by the people who've got a bit more power.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you used to have firms and people who owned the firms living in a society where they could see they needed people to buy their product, right? And so one of the problems is if you don't think you need your own people to buy your product and you can sell it off somewhere else, you might not care about redistributing that income back to your workers because you can sell your product somewhere else. Henry Ford at least realized that he needed his workers to be able to afford to buy his motor vehicles because that was the market.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that is one of
sure.
our problems is we've had that disconnect from that sense of businesses realizing that their workers are part of their market, right? And so we've seen more and more of income from the gains going to capital share as against to labour's share. And within the labour share, we've seen the reward for a smaller proportion go up. So we've seen that top 10% really rise compared
Mm-hmm.
to, the rest. So we've seen this sort of widening of the distribution of income from two
Yeah.
sources. One is ownership of capital is really actually very concentrated, despite John Howard told us we're all owners of shares now through our superannuation,
Yeah.
right? Some people own a
Nice
hell of a
idea.
lot more than others, okay? And so
Indeed,
we
indeed.
know that, the top 10% own almost, 90% or more of the of shares. So they're the ones who benefit out of it when the share prices go up and the like. So we've got to kind of put that in perspective. So if the returns on capital go up, then capital keeps, and we've had a whole bunch of stuff. You can't tax capital, returns on capital, because you will stifle investment, right? But
Mm,
if ownership of capital is concentrated, that means the people who own the capital and are getting the rewards from capital pay less and less of the taxes, and the people
mhm.
who are earning wage income pay more and more of the taxes. And so that's one of the problems is that labor is actually highly taxed compared to capital. And so if you have a system that has actually, so if we look at the Milton Friedman thing, the Laffer curve under Ronald Reagan, all those
Yeah.
arguments, that top marginal tax rate. I heard Pauline Hanson say the other day that, when she was growing up, they didn't tax like this. Well, the top marginal tax rate was 70% when she was growing up. So,
Mm, 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 mm.
I think she ought to
Yeah.
rethink that one a little bit. But, the top marginal tax rate came down substantially. And for the first time, we got a really big, like in fact, tax-free threshold is now close to 20,000, I think. So it
Mm.
used to be you sort of paid tax on the first dollar you earned, right?
Yeah.
So workers really, and so we've seen some things at the bottom that have been beneficial, but some things at the top with that coming down. But what really is the rules. So it comes back to if you can work out how to avoid taxes. So if you're a mug punter and you get your dividends on your shares, you pay tax on that at your marginal tax rate, right? But
Right.
if you're a owner of a business that owns those shares, that business gets that gain and then doesn't because it takes it as capital gain or it takes it as corporate income or it does it some other way, right? So
Mm,
ultimately, it's what we've seen is this widening of the distribution of income. And so this is where the minimum basic income idea comes in. So there's got two
mm,
aspects to that. And one is this idea that if people could have a certain amount of money, they would be far more innovative and they could take risks and they could go, do artistic pursuits and they would come up with creative things and they would then move into making a lot of money. And so this is this sort of, we should all have a certain amount. We've got
mm.
something called unemployment insurance. It's not generous at all. Well, it's called, job seeker, right?
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
effectively a minimum basic income. We're not going to leave you to starve on the streets if you don't have a job.
Mm,
We might get you close since you can't afford to pay rent, but we also have rent support and then other things and the like, right? The US doesn't have that. right?
Mm,
Unemployment insurance is only 6 months over there, and
mm,
it's based on your previous employment. You have some certain, cash grants for pe families with children, but so minimum basic income is a different thing. And the idea was everybody got it, but most people would pay taxes, so effectively that you'd pay it, you wouldn't get it in net because you'd have to pay more taxes to pay for everybody's minimum basic income. And so it's got to be paid for somehow. So that's the first problem, is that you still have to pay for minimum basic income if you decide to do that. The second problem is they did some bunch of randomized controlled trials to see whether it did actually lead to innovative activity. And the answer was it
mm,
didn't. Right? People were less poor than they were before. So that was good. But so poverty rates went down, but did it lead to a whole bunch of more employment and innovative activity? And in the studies that they've done in the US, they found the answer is no.
Jenny, I think that is probably the perfect place to pause. What becomes clear is that many of the assumptions that have underpinned Australia's prosperity for decades can no longer be taken for granted. In part two, we're going to move from diagnosis to prescription. We'll examine the choices Australia faces, the trade offs involved, and whether we can realistically afford the future we say we want. Jenny, thank you for joining us for part one. And to our audience, thanks for listening. Part two will be available shortly. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay focused. We'll see you next time on the Focus Podcast.